Today I'm on Dublin's North Quays, and this is the famine memorial. Between 1845 and 1850, over 1 million Irish people starved to death. 2 million more emigrated, and it's incredible when you think about it in this day and age that people actually died of hunger in Ireland. You wouldn't think it could happen, but it did. So in this video we're going to talk about it, how it happened, why it happened, and if anybody was responsible. In the early part of the 19th century, Irish people were taller, healthier and more fertile than most of the rest of Europe, and all thanks to this. All thanks to these.
The potato was the main food of the poor people in Ireland. Potatoes were part of every meal, and back then Irish people had very large families.
Kids, will you come in out of that for the bit of dinner?
So potatoes were easy to grow, easy to harvest, and you could store them, which was important. In fact, you could grow a potato in almost any soil, anywhere.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Jesus, look at all those potatoes.
So while their diet was limited, Irish people were well fed and nourished thanks to the humble spud.
In the 1840s, Ireland was part of the British Empire, and English aristocrats owned most of the land. Irish farmers had to sell their grain and livestock to pay the rent to these landlords, leaving them with only the potato crop to feed themselves. The Union Jack flew in every Irish town and city, and technically the people of Ireland were regarded as British as anyone born in England, Scotland or Wales. However, Irish people were different from the British in many ways. We spoke a different language. Although for centuries the English had imposed their language on Ireland, millions could still only speak Gaelic, particularly in the west and south of the country. Most could barely read or write, which is still the case in Galway to this day. We were an agricultural country. The Industrial Revolution had turned Britain into an industrial superpower. Hundreds of thousands of men were employed in British cities, operating machinery in factories. Britain also had a massive rail network to transport goods anywhere very quickly. In contrast, Ireland had very little industry, most people worked on the land, and the west of Ireland was isolated from the rest of the country. We were a different religion as well. Most people in Britain were Protestants, but apart from Ulster, almost everyone in Ireland was Catholic. The British didn't trust Catholics. They believed they were loyal to the Pope, not to the King. The British had even brought in penal laws once, which prevented Catholics from holding religious services, attending school, owning a business, or voting in an election. In Britain, newspapers and magazines described the Irish as uncivilized, ape-like savages who were inferior to the British themselves. These magazines portrayed Irish people as stupid, ignorant, lazy, superstitious, backward, and not to be trusted. Millions of people read these publications, and the stereotype of the subhuman, alcoholic Irishman with his superstitious religion living in a cottage full of filthy children was widespread in Britain. In the summer of 1845, the potato harvest failed because of blight. The blight was a fungus that rotted potatoes in the ground and made them inedible. Ireland was badly affected, but as half of the crop was saved, and because most people had a store of potatoes from the previous year, people just about survived, and hoped a good potato harvest would arrive the following year. Tragically, it never came. From 1846 to 1850, the potato crop consistently failed, plunging Ireland into a catastrophic hunger crisis that lasted for another 4 years. The worst year of the famine was 1847, known as Black 47. Over 400,000 people starved to death that year. Entire villages were wiped out. The dead lay where they fell for weeks with nobody to bury them. The famine had left thousands of families unable to pay their rent, so the landlords evicted them and burnt their homes to the ground. One landlord in Mayo demolished a large village and built a racecourse over it. Landlords refused to allow anyone to fish in the rivers and streams. Those caught stealing food were sent to penal colonies in Australia. Disease caused by extreme hunger and malnutrition was rampant. The starving poor ate leaves, grass, seaweed, and the bark off trees. They ate the blight-riddled potatoes, which made them violently ill. They sold what little they had to buy food and begged for help in the towns. Finally, they died like animals by the roadside, young and old alike, with countless numbers thrown into mass graves, denied the dignity of a proper burial. Those that could escape left Ireland in droves. Every port in the country was crammed as over 2 million Irish men and women fled from the famine on coffin ships, where disease and overcrowding claimed many more lives. By the time the famine ended in the early 1850s, the population of Ireland had been cut by over a quarter, from 8.4 million to 6 million, and those who did survive suffered enormously for the rest of their lives.
So how could a famine like this happen in modern Europe? Well, there's an old saying, God sent the blight, but the English sent the potato famine. When I was a kid in school, 20 years ago, we were never taught this, probably because of the troubles in Northern Ireland. But it's undeniable that in the middle of the 19th century, the British government allowed 1 million Irish people to starve because they weren't willing to spend the money to stop it happening.
And this suited the English public, who were, as we've said, deeply prejudiced against the Catholic Irish. Many British people felt Ireland was just an ungrateful colony that didn't appreciate all that England had done for us. They ignored the fact that Irish poverty was caused by Britain taking everything from us, or that 40% of the soldiers in the British Army were from Ireland. The British believed the famine was our own fault because we had outdated farming methods, that we were poor, lazy, and didn't deserve help.
Right. I mean, if it was just the potatoes that were affected, at the end of the day, you will pay the price if you're a fussy eater. If they could afford to emigrate, then they could afford to eat in a modest restaurant.
One man who certainly believed this was a civil servant named Charles Trevelyan, who's the real villain of this story. Unfortunately for Ireland, Trevelyan controlled how much British money was spent here, and he firmly believed the famine was God's way of reducing Ireland's excess population. He felt if Britain were to try and help the starving Irish, that would be going against God's will. Trevelyan and many others in the British government felt if they helped Ireland with the famine, we'd come to rely on them instead of fixing our own problems. Trevelyan called the famine a good mechanism for reducing surplus population and the judgment of God on the evil of the selfish, perverse and turbulent character of the Irish. He thought all the starving Irish being evicted off the land was an economic miracle. The anti-Irish newspapers in England were pleased about the famine and mass Irish emigration too. The Times wrote, "Thanks to a bountiful providence, the Irishman on the banks of the Shannon will soon be as rare a sight as the Red Indian on the banks of the Hudson. It's very difficult to deny that Britain wanted the land of Ireland, but not its people." Proof of this is the fact that while Ireland starved, we still sent tons of food to Britain every day during the famine. There was loads of food in Ireland. We just weren't allowed to keep it. It was only the potato crop that failed, so if all the oats, grain and cattle exported to England had been distributed among the Irish people instead, nobody would have died of starvation. The governments of Belgium and France closed their ports to prevent food being taken out of the country. They also gave free bread to the poor and paid them for doing work so they could buy food. But Ireland didn't have its own government. We were ruled by the British Empire, and they treated the famine as a local problem that the Irish themselves should pay for. Despite being a supposedly equal part of the United Kingdom, Britain spent as little as possible on the Irish famine. The British had the capability to feed the starving Irish, but weren't willing to do it. During Black 47, British soup kitchens fed over 3 million people, which hugely reduced the death rate. These soup kitchens were very effective and cost very little. But that autumn, the British government closed the kitchens and people immediately started dying of hunger again. At the time, Ireland was part of the British Empire and Irish people were subjects of Queen Victoria. She became known as the Famine Queen because she did so little to help Ireland in its hour of need. In fact, she donated only £2,000 towards famine relief. The Sultan of Turkey, a Muslim country 2,000 miles away, wanted to give £10,000 to help Ireland, but nobody was allowed to donate more than the Queen, and she refused to give a penny more. That £10,000 from the Sultan would have saved a lot of lives. So that's the famine, the greatest catastrophe in Irish history that probably could have been prevented if the British government had wanted to do so. Genocide is when a race of people is deliberately destroyed, something the Nazis attempted to do to European Jews during World War II. Although the word didn't exist in the 1840s, some modern historians believe that the Irish famine was a genocide. Britain deliberately allowed the people of Ireland to starve to death because it benefited them.
Politically as well, the famine had a big impact on Irish people. We stopped trusting the British, our imperial masters, to do right by us. There'd always been nationalist sentiment in Ireland, but it grew stronger. The Fenians developed, and from then, the IRA developed. And to this day in Ireland, any sporting victory for Ireland over England is celebrated wildly.
Finally, because the east of Ireland wasn't as badly affected by the famine, many country people moved from rural areas to Dublin, a tradition that continues to this day. Attracted by things like footpaths, running water and electricity, they do their best to blend into the capital city, though their efforts aren't always completely successful.